on this AMA session with us. So more about Stephanie Weber. She is the owner of on the Webs, a technology consultancy. She currently works alongside the amazing folks at Greyshore Partners, building delivery ecosystems, working on all things cloud and infrastructure, and sharing her love of automation and security. She's also one half of the Intelligent Hoodlums, a company she co-founded that focuses on virtual event production and the evolution of education. So with this introduction, let us all welcome Stephanie Weber, and then we can start our AMA session.
Thanks so much, Shermaine and Maitri.
No problem. So with that, we will dive into our first question of the day. So Stephanie, due to the pandemic, engineers are mostly connecting remotely to access the data, which will open the window for attacks and phishing. So how do you think we can go about such risks?
Yeah, I think a lot of preventing things from like that from happening is good general security hygiene. So, being aware, like if you do get an email that looks suspicious, or even in one that you're like on the fence about, going to that organization, if you can, like going to that website in your browser, not clicking on a link in the email. Thinking about, because really like security is, I think of it as a continuum, right? It's this balance between being secure and having things that are convenient. And we have to decide where it works for us on that continuum and how much convenience we're willing to give in order to remain secure and protect our information. I think one really basic thing to be able to do that most places offer now is enabling multi-factor authentication. Making sure that's on all accounts, because sometimes we think, oh, it's not a big deal. It's just my, fast food account or my food ordering account or something that we consider kind of a throwaway account. And so we won't secure it as well. We might recycle a password, and that's a perfect opportunity if that website were to be compromised, that password gets stolen and then other accounts are compromised. So I think enabling multi-factor authentication is one pretty like low-hanging fruit thing that we can do to be protective of our accounts when we're working remotely, or anytime really. Like this isn't exclusive to working remotely, but it definitely improves, when you're working remotely. Again, making sure we're not using those throwaway passwords. Thinking about how you manage repositories, I think, is a big one. A colleague of mine actually brought this to my attention. If you have to make a decision about how do you want to manage the repositories that you're using, do you want to delete them as soon as you're done using them for the day? Do you want to delete them once a week? Making sure, again, that you're using strong authentication, you're using an RSA key when you're pulling down those repositories. So that is another key way that, working remotely, pulling repositories remotely, what is your hygiene like around managing those repositories? Definitely using a password manager. If you have a system that you engage with that asks you those secret questions, making sure, my suggestion would be to use a password manager or something that's going to generate random passwords for you. Don't use the actual answers to those questions. Just make a secure note somewhere of, hey, this is the answer that I did for this, and store that in your password manager. And then kind of doing a little bit of personal threat modeling might be a good idea, because it depends. And that's going to be probably a lot of my answer today. It depends on your specific situation. It depends on the systems you're working with. It depends on the company that you're working with, what your setup is. So doing a little bit of kind of personal threat modeling, or thinking about what data are you concerned about protecting and how do you plan to protect it? What access are you concerned about protecting and how do you plan to protect it? So if you have, if you're going to use a VPN, if you have, passwords to protect, how are you going to go about that? That balances for you that convenience with the security, and leaning as much as you can toward the security side.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was very informative. Thank you. We have a question in Q&A from Mai. Thank you for your question, Mai. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. I'm hoping that it's correct. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. The question is, there are some security standards like ISO 27001 or something like that. Which ones would you recommend when you start technology consultancy? Like,
That's a great question. I think that, so definitely ISO 27001, or whatever you want to call it. That's a solid one to start with. Another one would be the NIST standards. So the National Institute for Standards and Technology, I think it is, if I'm recalling correctly. That's another great one to follow along to like kind of check. Also the CIS standards. So the Center for Internet Security has some really good ones. Depending on what you're working with, payment card industry standards also might be worth taking a look at. But probably the three that I see most often are ISO, CIS, and the NIST 853. I know most cloud providers have some sort of policy application that you can apply. The only kind of piece of experiential advice is make sure you understand the controls that the cloud provider puts into place in order to adhere to what their interpretation of that particular standard is. Because I've seen situations where the way that the cloud provider decides to implement the controls that they think align with that particular standard may be overly restrictive, and you may have a different way of meeting that particular standard without having to be so restrictive, depending on your environment and your project. So if you run into that, I would highly suggest making sure you understand what the compensating control is and how that aligns to the standard, so that you can make the decision of, is this the way that we want to go? Do we want to follow along with this? And how, and like, are we okay with the way that they're choosing to implement it? And it might seem like, oh, that's a lot of work. Like, why would we bother to do that? But when you're implementing those policies from your cloud provider, it kind of like will take care of 90% of things, or even 95% of things, without disrupting or causing problems for your implementation of whatever it is you're building. But there's probably like 5% of the time where you'll have to like check it, inspect it, make sure that whatever that standard is actually matches the way that they're using the compensating controls in the cloud environment. So, and I know like in particular, like most of my experience is in Azure. So in particular, like with Azure, if you inspect in the policy section how it's managing, like you can actually look at like, this is the compensating control that we're applying in order to meet this particular standard. And then you can go look up that standard and see like, okay, the standard is saying we have to have some sort of boundary protection. If we're going to have that boundary protection, like these are our compensating controls, and then making sure that you're documenting that and revisiting it regularly. That would be my suggestion. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that answer. So we got a new question from Paul in the Q&A section. And the question is, how can you encourage people to start using a password manager when they think it's too much trouble? Because she has never worked for a company that required the use of a password manager, even for her corporate account.
That is a great question, and actually one of my favorite questions. So, I tend to do it on I tend to meet people where they are. So, in a past life, I worked in education and I was a digital learning coach. With that role, I went into schools and worked with teachers to help them learn how to integrate technology into their teaching. And one of the things that I learned from that position was you have to meet people where they are. And unfortunately, like in the security domain of tech, we tend to come across as a little arrogant sometimes. And that's not really going to be the best way to convince people to do things like adopt a password manager. A lot of my success has been around demonstrating the value in it. So like the frustration with how do I remember all these passwords? You know, there's the meme out on the internet of like, I know I should have a more complex password, but my brain can't remember it or something along those lines. So I think kind of offloading that effort to remember passwords into an application, and then also demonstrating how you can use it in lots of places. So you can get the add-on for your browser. You can have the application on your computer. You can have the mobile application. And then the other big piece is, which is something that I volunteered to do at one of my past workplaces. I said, if you want to set up a password manager, let me know. I will sit with you as long as it takes, help you set it up, walk you through it, demonstrate how to use it. A lot of it. So I think the two biggest things are providing that support for enablement, for demystifying how complicated it is. And the other piece is meeting people where they are and not making them feel bad. Like I had at a previous workplace, I worked with someone who was a business analyst, and this person was ashamed that they were working in tech for as long as they had been and still didn't have a password manager. And so they didn't want to tell anyone, because if they told someone, they were afraid that they would get the whole, how could you not have a password manager? You work in tech, da, da, da. I said, I don't care. You're asking now. That's all that matters. I will sit with you. We can set it up. I can show you how to use it. You have me available anytime if you get stuck, if you need help. I've successfully converted some older friends of mine, as well as my mom, to using a password manager. And so I think that's a lot of it, is like meeting people where they are and then being supportive if they need help figuring out how to navigate it or if they get frustrated.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. So we have next question in Q&A from Ryan. And the question is, what are ways or sources you use to stay current on information security?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think a lot of it comes from like social media. So I learned a while back that the best way for me to keep up on things or to learn things is to put it in my path. So following people like on Twitter who I know are security specialists that are far more knowledgeable than I am, people that are well respected in the industry and that I also, respect after having seen their opinions on things. So that's part of it, because then it kind of is effortless because it's just sort of always there. And even like following certain people on Twitter, then Twitter suggests to me like, hey, here's some more InfoSec stuff you might be interested in. And it kind of snowballs, and it's kind of an effortless snowball. By doing that, it also tends to put different resources in my path, things like, NIST or CIS or stuff like that. Everybody has a newsletter. So if you find folks that you know are knowledgeable, or organizations are knowledgeable, subscribing to their newsletter so it comes right to your inbox, and then you can kind of go through and say, We Hack Purple is one that I subscribe to. Also, I did a blog post with some resources that'll go out in a few minutes. So don't stress too much over getting everything that I mentioned, because I kind of try to compile it all for folks so that you can go peruse at your leisure later. But yeah, I think like making it as low effort and low friction as possible for you to consume what people are offering is probably the best way to keep informed. Because I would love to say that, I go to the NIST website and read it thoroughly every Tuesday, but that's not real. Like I have a job to do. I have, hobbies outside of work. I have lots of other things. And so I find the easiest way for me to keep up to date on things is follow the right people on social media, subscribe to newsletters that will pop up with information, that and like news headlines. So by being interested in certain topics, certain news headlines come up. And like one of the things we started doing at the last client that I was on was we did like a book club around security centric like news articles. Because when they release like a new CVE or something, a new vulnerability is discovered, those articles and write-ups are fascinating, but they are really heavy. And I think depending on where you are in your experience, it can be overwhelming to try and think through something like that. So we picked an article to kind of go over and read as sort of a book club style thing. We all read it and met up and then talked about things we thought were interesting, questions we had, and making that a space where people can feel comfortable asking questions was made it so that everybody could kind of level up their skills together. So that's another possibility, is like find articles you think are interesting that you want to discuss with people and set up a book club style discussion that you can do to keep up to date on those topics.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Yep, that was a very detailed answer. So let's move on to another question that we gathered before this session began. So the question is, with regards to test environments or local dev environments, we often deal with a lot of password, API keys, connection strings, etc. And this person finds that we share a lot of these through Slack, Microsoft Teams, email, etc., which she imagines is not the best way. So what would you recommend for handling this in a more secure manner?
The best approach is to have a key vault. Like especially if you're working in a cloud environment, there is no reason why you shouldn't immediately set up a key vault. That should be one of the first things that you do. I think every provider offers a key vault. Key vaults usually have an API, so you can access the secrets you need in your pipeline or in your app or wherever you need to access them. And that key vault should be kind of where everything goes through. Also making sure that you're setting up permissions for that key vault so that the right people have access and the right people have the right access. So making sure that like, if I don't need access to read and write secrets, then I don't have that access. If all I need is the ability to make an API call to get what I need, then that's the access that I should have. Really avoiding sharing over like messaging is super important, not sharing it over in any kind of plain text fashion. And if you have that key vault set up, there should be really no reason why you need to share it in that manner. I even had a situation recently where we were setting up certificates. And so I just had the person who procured the certificates put them into the key vault, and that unblocked me so that I could do what I needed to do with the certificates. And then I didn't even need to be aware of them. So it would definitely be like set up that key vault, use that key vault in a cloud environment. Everybody should use a key vault.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. So we have 2 questions from Mai, and the questions are, how do you decide to be a security specialist? And also, was it difficult to start your own tech consultancy?
How did I decide to be a security specialist? So like I said, previous life, I was a teacher. I decided to switch careers. And one of the things that I always thought was really interesting, and I always kind of had a tendency for, was a kind of security mindset. So one of the things that like when I was working at the school, one of the things that I always thought about was our student safety. So, the ability for someone to get into the building unauthorized, the ability for someone to even get on the grounds unauthorized. If people were walking around the school, making sure that they were properly credentialed, making sure we knew who they were and that they were on campus. So I kind of had that security mindset even before I got into security or got into tech. And then when I was thinking about switching fields and looking at all the options that were out there, I thought that the security related things were really interesting to me. Not only from the perspective of like things that can go wrong and bugs that can happen, but also like the puzzles of how to see if there are bugs that are there or see if there are vulnerabilities or ways to get access to things. Those are interesting puzzles to me. And I knew that it was a field that didn't have a lot of women in it. And I knew it was a field that was pretty high demand and it was interesting to me. So all of those things kind of combined, made it so that that was a topic that I was interested in, when I switched, fields. Then the best advice I got was like my very first week on the job. Someone said, whatever you're interested in, talk about that. Like make that part of your introduction. Hi, I'm Webs. I really like security. And I did that. And so people kind of knew, on the different projects that I worked on, like, oh yeah, Webs is really interested in security. That'd be someone to talk to if you're looking for a security champion. So that's how I got interested in it and kind of like developed a reputation, I guess you could say, for being a person who really cares about security. As for starting my own consultancy, at the beginning of the pandemic, I had just left a job and was supposed to be like, had an offer from a different position, and they ended up rescinding the offer because of the pandemic, and they were worried and didn't want to bring new people on. So I found myself kind of afloat, and fortunately was put into contact with Paula, who runs Greyshore, and that kind of got me started, and that's who I work with now. And so it was kind of by accident. But it's been wonderful, and I don't ever want to go back to not working for myself. It was definitely meant to be. I totally agree with that.
That's such a nice answer.
That's great, Stephanie.
Yeah.
It's always good to keep ourselves occupied. I agree.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. So what are some security must-haves in the cloud, like best practices, which also links to the questions that CC Young asked, what's the best practice for laptop passwords as well, since it's hard to use password managers for them. So the first part is, what are some security must-haves in the cloud, like best practices? And then you can follow up with what's the best practice for laptop passwords.
Yeah. I think a lot of it depends on who you are. So, thinking about security practices in the cloud, if you are a developer, like an app developer, your needs are slightly different than, say, someone who's building infrastructure, which your concerns are slightly different than someone who maybe is head of InfoSec, right? So I think focusing on at least those first two. So if you're a developer, I think having good hygiene with your secrets, all the things we talked about before, working remotely, making sure that when you are pulling secrets, you're not putting them into pipelines in plain text, you're not baking them into images, you're using the key vault like we talked about, you have multi-factor set up on your accounts. I think also throughout the development process, asking the questions of, is there data that needs to be protected here? Is there access that needs to be protected? And how are we going to go about doing that? I think that it might be slightly different for the cloud than if you weren't in the cloud, but I don't think it's all that much different. Making sure that you're not sharing credentials. So one of the common things that I've seen happen in the past is out of frustration or out of that it's more convenience, you'll see folks that will share one credential for multiple things. Or just because that's the way that a company has always worked, they just have this one shared credential, either for a QA environment, because they think, oh, it's just the QA dashboard, we can have this shared credential, it's not a big deal, everybody just knows this username and password. But the problem there then is if something goes wrong, you can't track the person who actually, caused the issue, because everybody shares that username and password. So making sure you're not sharing credentials, protecting your APIs using tokens, access tokens, ideally OpenID Connect access tokens with appropriate and fine-grained scopes and policies. That's another kind of common mistake, is making overly permissive tokens that then have access to your entire API, or not using them at all. Using something more like a basic auth that's then hard-coded username and password. Because there's an idea that like, oh, but nobody will ever see that. Nobody will ever access that. But you have to keep in mind that like, there's always somebody who wants to get that information. So from a developer perspective, that would be my suggestion. If you're building infrastructure, like we do a lot, then thinking about how you're going to do identity and access management. What are authentication and authorization going to look like? Are you doing role-based access control? And if you are doing role-based access control, being thoughtful about what roles you're creating, being cautious of creating unique roles that, we're just going to create this one role for Bob so that it's easy for him to get what he needs. Well, in the short term, that seems like a good idea. But then what if you have one individual role for every single person? Then it gets messy. So trying to create as like generic roles as possible, or just use the built-in roles that most cloud providers offer when you're doing role-based access. Thinking about how you're going to store, access, and rotate your secrets, so that you have a solid pattern for how that'll be done. That way you don't get to where it's like, okay, we need to rotate the secret, but we're not really sure how we're going to do it. Or we need access to the secret, we're not really sure how to do that. Making sure you're clear on that. How will you know when something goes wrong? So setting up your observability early, having your logs and alerts ready so that you know when something goes wrong, but then also having tools in place to figure out what went wrong. So having tracing of some kind, having those logs in place, having auditability so that if, which most cloud providers again offer, so you can track based on those roles and the access that you've given people, who's making changes where. That's also a good question. I'll get to that one next. But yeah, so those are some of the like foundational things to think about. Also, most cloud providers have a cloud application or a cloud migration framework, where you can kind of follow the process of how do you map out that move to the cloud, or how do you map out even getting started in the cloud. And most of them, I want to say all, but definitely most of them, the two of the big ones, AWS and Azure, both have security-centric guides as well. And I see there's a question in the chat about, this sounds like potentially a lot of work, but most organizations only have 1 or 2 security engineers. How do you scale? And how can you automate? And I think there was a second part to this question too. But as far as scaling, I think part of it is enabling engineers to ask those questions. So going back to, is there data we need to protect? Is there access we need to protect? And how are we going to go about doing that? Because nobody's going to know everything, but if you can ask those 2 questions and research what the best strategy is for doing that, then that will solve most things. And by enabling engineers to also have a security ear out, it multiplies the security power, the security force, right? If everyone's, there's like every security is everyone's job, or something kind of cheesy like that. But I think the piece that's often missing is like, what are the practical ways that people can have that security mindset that don't require like learning a whole new vocabulary, or going and getting a bunch of certifications, or getting a whole degree. Like, there are questions you can ask and frameworks for thinking that can help like non-security specialists still have that security mindset. And definitely automation. Like, another great example is we were working on a project doing automated testing, automated end-to-end testing. We needed testing IDs. At the time we were using Okta. And so we set up 3 identities within Okta, and then within the pipeline made it so that we use the Okta API to automate enabling those accounts, changing the passwords, disabling those accounts once the testing was over with. So that made it so that automatically took place. We didn't have to manually go in and change any of that stuff. So automating as much of that stuff as possible, like rotation of secrets, rotating certificates. Like if you need to renew certificates, find a way to automate that. There's lots of available resources out there to automate that kind of thing. Also automating, like if something were to go wrong, right? So if there is either another good example might be like doing an NPM audit within your pipeline. So if you do an NPM audit, for folks who don't know, that checks to see if there are any vulnerabilities within your node packages. And if it'll tell you like high, medium, low. So if you run NPM audit within your pipeline, it can either break the pipeline if there's a high vulnerability. So you don't want to use that package, or you want to make sure that you deal with it. Or it can just warn you like, hey, FYI, these are how many high, medium, low vulnerabilities you have in your packages. So automation can definitely go far, getting into stuff like if you get into like automation around chat ops and having people do their commands like in a chat where it's visible to everyone and you have that auditability because it's always being tracked. That's another, opportunity or a place where you could automate. So yeah, those are a few different things that you can do in order to kind of scale out your engineers when your security team is but a team of 2. And there is a second part to that first question, but I can't remember what it was.
Firstly, thank you for taking up that question, Stephanie. I think that's the only question we have last.
The second part for the question is, what are some best practice for laptop passwords, since it's hard to use password managers for passwords for your laptops, like to log in?
I'm assuming that means like the password you enter to unlock your laptop. Is that correct? I'm assuming that's what they're referring to. So a couple of things, depending on the machine that you're using, some of them have either biometrics where you can, scan your fingerprint, do face recognition. Some of them connect to like on a Mac, you can open it with your Apple Watch. So you have a different device you can use to open it, but you have to have possession of that device in order to open it. Also, you can use a password manager on your mobile phone and save your password there if you want to, or set it up there. And then, you'd have to type it out, but you would still have a secure password saved somewhere that you can access it in the event you were to forget it. You could also think about something like doing a series of passphrases. So maybe there's something where when you sit down at your computer, you have this series of a series of words that will kind of be triggered when you sit down, like bottle, coffee, plug, blue, hexagon. And so it can be a really secure long password that is easy for you to remember because you see those things when you sit down at your computer, but it's pretty random for anybody else who's trying to guess what that password is. Also, don't save your password in your hint.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. So we have a next question in Q&A, which is how to connect or port forward safely by SSH or RDP to our VMs on cloud. Is it not safe for using IP address 0.0.0.0 and we don't have any other subnets left over?
Okay. I'll do my best to answer this question. I don't completely understand what they're asking, but it is definitely not safe to set 0000 as your default, because that will allow just about anyone. You want to make sure, I guess, when we're thinking about best practices, kind of like we talked about earlier, if you're going to SSH, most cloud providers have some sort of a CLI that you can use, like a tool in your command line that you can log into. And I would say that would be the ideal way to interact if you don't have the option. I would just say that like that's the ideal way to interact, because that already has the built-in APIs for when you are trying to interact with your cloud resources. it depends on your situation, but I would say ideally, like you shouldn't or wouldn't want to be able to directly SSH into your VMs. You would want to kind of like work through your cloud provider. And of course, there are probably exceptions to that depending on your situation. But I would say like in an ideal situation, you'd want to avoid SSHing directly and just work through your CLI that your cloud provider gives you in terms of making modifications to your virtual machines. Because really your virtual machines shouldn't be like these individual little, orchids that you have to take very special care of. Your virtual machines should be something you can spin up, spin down, destroy on a whim. That's kind of the benefit of working in the cloud, is that hopefully you're using something like infrastructure as code to maintain the formatting and setup of those virtual machines so that you don't have to treat them as individual special flowers that you have to take special care of. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, then we move on to the next question by Ryan. What's your opinion on how we, as a society, can get companies to take security seriously? Data breaches have become a commonplace. Do you see any promising ideas or initiatives to reverse this trend?
Ooh, such good questions. Also very deep questions. Gosh, companies, it's really hard because I feel like unless there are heavy consequences to having a breach, which presently I don't feel like there are really heavy consequences, we've kind of accepted that like breaches happen and it's not even all that much damaging depending on your company. If it's a retail company, if it's I don't know, like a fast food company or something, then the impact of a breach, I feel like, isn't as bad as, say, if you were a tech company, right? Because your responsibility is to manage tech. So if you can't keep your own house secure, then it reflects poorly on you, and other people in tech don't want to do business with you. However, for other companies, unless there's like a really strong, probably monetary consequence, I don't foresee them taking it super seriously. I think you can have a grassroots like culture shift. And like personally, I think security is just as much about culture change as it is about education. So we focus a lot on the education piece of security, but I think there's just as much effort that needs to be put into the shift of culture. For example, I was on a project early on in my career, and folks were passing like Wi-Fi passwords over chat and that kind of a thing. And I was really passionate about like, hey, how can we make it easy for you to still share your password without doing it in plain text over chat? And so rather than like shaming people or being upset with them, I could see that the problem, and often the problem, is the friction that's caused by secure practices. So how can we make incremental change and shift the culture to one where people actually care about secure practices and they aren't this hurdle to overcome? It's fairly frictionless, or maybe the added friction is minimal. Because I think most of the time, if folks are working around security protocols, it's because it causes so much friction that it's frustrating. And so understanding people just want to do their jobs. And if you make it so that doing their job securely is an easy option, then I think that, will kind of shift culture from the bottom up, instead of this, okay, if we punish a company for having a breach, then they might change things. But most of the time, they're just going to like check the boxes and say, oh yeah, we did something, yay, till it happens again. And I think too, from a user perspective, understanding that like, it's not a question of if it's going to happen, it's just when and what account is it going to impact. So having those secure practices in place all the time, so that when a breach does happen, you are like, I mean, that sucks, but also it doesn't drastically impact every other account that I have. And I think too, educating the folks around you. And like recently I was talking to my mom about multi-factor authentication and explaining like, this is how it works. This is why it's beneficial. And she was saying, why wouldn't everybody use this? And I think a lot of it is just vocabulary. Like, we may understand a concept, but when you throw on complex vocabulary, it seems like it's confusing. So I think demystifying it and making it very simple for folks to understand and adopt makes it so that you can have that cultural shift.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. So the next question we have is, it is from Luis. And the question is, what do you think of the variety of cybersecurity focused boot camps being offered by universities? Is there a way to evaluate whether the programs are worth the money?
So I come from a background where when I decided to get into tech, I looked at boot camps, and for me, they were financially out of reach. Not only that, but my roommate pointed out to me that I have a background in education, and there is a real high possibility I could design my own curriculum because I know how designing educational curriculum works. And so I think, like I keep saying, it depends. So to answer the first part of your question, what do I think about the boot camps? I think it depends on what kind of learner you are. And so for folks who are looking to get more into, maybe that particular area of tech, or this would really apply to anyone trying to learn a thing. Knowing what kind of learner you are and knowing what you need is going to be essential to your success going forward. So for me, I am good at creating my own structure. I have the background in education, so I kind of know how to structure curriculum. So it was worth it for me to attempt to figure out how to do it myself and see how successful I could be. If I know I'm the type of learner who needs to be physically present so that I don't have any other distractions, maybe I live in a house with a lot of other folks and I don't have that private space to kind of study and focus. Maybe I just need to there are too many distractions. Like I might want to go do the dishes or go outside, or there are too many distractions if I try to learn from home. And I know I need to go to another place in order to be successful. Maybe I'm the type of learner who needs a bit more structure in order to be successful. So I need someone else to kind of tell me what I need to do. That way I can focus on the learning. All of those things are important, and you kind of have to know that about yourself in order to know if you're going to be successful doing an online program, doing an in-person program, having an instructor guide you, having an instructor just offer you resources. If you're going to do better reading things, listening to things, watching things, doing projects. So that would be kind of piece number one. It depends on the type of learner you are. I think there are definitely some boot camps that are great, have great reputations. I would say I don't have a framework for you to evaluate, but some things I would think about are like, do you know anyone who has gone through that boot camp or that program? Evaluating the cost. So figuring out like, how much does it cost me to go to this program versus am I guaranteed a position when I get out? Is it highly likely that I'll get a position when I get out? If I can't find a position when I get out, am I still okay with that financial responsibility? So considering all of those things along with your personal financial situation, talking to people who have gone through the program before, seeing if the program will connect you with people who have gone through the program before, doing some research and just generally Googling, seeing if people have posted about it. Folks will talk on Reddit all day or Twitter all day about their experiences with different things. So you can almost positively, like, especially if a program was bad, people will definitely like make it known they were unhappy with whatever that thing is. So it depends, but those are some kind of heuristics I would use to evaluate something like that.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. So we have a question from Paula in the chat. It says, if your company is using an external vendor to perform a penetration test, what are some things you can do to ensure that you are ready?
I think some things you can do to make sure you're ready would be ideally having, in an ideal situation, you've been working with your developers from the very beginning, talking about, is there data we need to protect? Is there access we need to protect? How are we planning to protect that? That would be an ideal situation. Let's say it's not an ideal situation. You're just calling in a vendor to do a penetration test. I would say making sure you're communicating with the folks that are like the logistics of said test. So, in an ideal situation, you could just say, hey, pen testers, go pen test in this environment, enjoy. Sometimes that's not the case. Thinking about like, if there was a disruption, what impact would that have? Are you okay with that impact? I would think about things like, do you have all the credentials and access you need for the pen testers in order for them to do what they need to do, and kind of taking an inventory of the things that they need and the places you may want to poke around and test. There was a really great article, which I think I might have put, if I didn't, I'll have to add it to the resources. There was a really great article from on We Hack Purple, where she talked about some questions to ask around pen testing. And I'll be sure to link that in the blog post. But yeah, those are some things that I would think about when it comes to penetration testing. Is, like I said, in an ideal world, you've been thinking about this throughout the entire software development life cycle. If you haven't, then consider, if there are disruptions, are you okay with those disruptions? Do you have things in place for how people are supposed to handle those disruptions? Are you giving your pen testers everything that they need in order to be successful? And have you made it clear? That's another thing I think too, is being very clear on what the rules of engagement are, making sure that they know this is what's okay with us, this is what is not. And knowing that you are not just at the mercy of your pen testers. Like, this is a conversation, that you are trying to get useful information for your system, but that they don't get to just do whatever they want. And I think, for the most part, I think companies who are responsible about that should also set you up for success by making sure that those things are known, and that you are in an agreement, and you have a shared understanding of what is the expected rules. I mean, what are the expected rules of engagement, and what are the expected outcomes? I would also be clear on that. Like, what do you expect to get out of this pen test? What do you want to see in the report? So those are some things that I would think about.
That was informative, Stephanie. Thank you. The last and next question we have in the Q&A is from Al. The question is, how can I know if I'm interested in focusing about information security without making a big commitment, like a boot camp or a university course?
I would say, if you think you're interested in information security or security in general, for one, do a Google search. Google search what's out there. Look, some of the things that I suggested, looking at NIST, what they have to offer. In my blog post, I'll also share some places you can go to kind of get started. There's a lot of really great websites out there for kind of playing around in the InfoSec space. Hacksplaining is one of them. Over the Wire, Under the Wire, Secure Code Warrior. So if you want to just kind of dip your toe into the water, OWASP Juice Shop is another one, into the water of what it is like to kind of get into that space. A lot of that is offensive stuff, but as you learn the offensive piece, then you can also become more familiar with the defensive piece. So I recommend, if you are an application developer, kind of like playing with those, especially like Hacksplaining. Hacksplaining.com is really light. It's very user-friendly. I think it's really engaging because they kind of give you these little test environments to play around in that can give you some knowledge. Because if you understand how people are trying to hack your system, you can be better about how you defensively code what you're building. So I would start with things like that, because then you can kind of just play around casually, do sort of like, not capture the flag exactly, but do some of those like puzzle environments and see if you like it. I would say then, if you do like it and you think you do have a passion for security, tell everyone that you come into contact with. Volunteer to be the security champion on your project. Think about things always from a security perspective. Share articles you come across with, share resources you come across with. And just over time, folks will kind of associate you with security, and you'll see more opportunities to be able to, get into that security space. And one really lightweight way to do it is, always asking that question as you're doing development. Is there data we need to protect? Is there access we need to protect? How are we going to protect it? Because identifying those things, I know there was a question in the Slack about threat modeling. And there are a bajillion different ways of threat modeling. But one of my kind of beefs with threat modeling is it's very heavy and with a lot of the frameworks that are out there. And it kind of assumes you have a certain level of background knowledge in order to be successful, which folks may not have. So like there was one about what, I can't remember what it was exactly. It was like, what are we building or what are we protecting? I can't remember. But that seemed kind of broad, whereas what information or data do we need to protect and what access do we need to protect are very specific questions. Like I remember early on, I was doing a threat modeling exercise when I was first learning about how threat modeling worked. And it was like, imagine all the things that could go wrong. The way my brain works, I am going to go to the most extreme, ridiculous possible situation. And I'm like, okay, what if polar bears get into our server room? What if, there is a flood? What if aliens come down? Like, these are not particularly helpful for the situation at hand. So things like that weren't helpful to my brain. I need more focus in that. So that's where I came up with these 2 questions to ask. Well, I guess it's kind of 3, in order to make it so that you can inject that throughout the development process. And it makes it very lightweight and accessible. There's no new vocabulary to learn. It's just about how you're thinking about the thing that you're building. So if you find using those things that you really like, those activities and those puzzles, and this is a really interesting like field for you, then I would say, hey, I'm a security champion and I'm really interested in security, asking those questions and just like getting people to associate you with security. Volunteer to help people set up their password manager. You can do some good while you're out there.
Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. But unfortunately, we are running out of time. So perhaps you want to share with all the attendees here the resources that you prepared for them. Maybe you can like send the link in the chat. Yep. So Stephanie has prepared a wonderful website with all the resources that she found. So please feel free to click that link and check the stuff that she prepared for all of us. So
also there is an option to save the chat so that you don't miss out all the information we have in today's chat. You can also save the chat by clicking on 3 dots in your chat option.
Okay, with that, this is the end of our AMA session. So please stay connected with us, Women Who Code Cloud. Join us on social media. Our handle is WWCode Cloud. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and even LinkedIn. And these are upcoming events that you can find on our website. And Stephanie Weber would also be speaking at the UAP's event on 15 July for my side, but it will be 14 July for most of you. So please go ahead and register for that event. And with that, thank you so much for your time. And please remember to stay connected. You can also join us on our Slack channel so that you won't miss out on all our track events as well. So with that, thank you so much for your time, everyone. And
thank you everybody
Stephanie.
for joining us today and making it a good session. We are hoping that everything was informative to you. And if there are any questions that we missed out, please let us know on Slack or on our social media links so that we can get them answered. And also you can reach out to Stephanie and she can help you out.
Yep. My website is websonthewebs.com. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm at Weber's Words. And thanks so much, Charmaine and Maitri. I really enjoyed being here today.
Thank you.
Enjoyed listening to you too.
Thank you. Everybody stay safe and hoping that you all have an amazing day and an amazing weekend as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much, Stephanie, for taking out the time today. We really, really appreciate it. And we can't wait to have you back for the next event.
Thanks so much.
Yay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much
Bye.
for your time.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Shamin, you will have to end the session.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye.